Thank you all for coming. I'm Peter Foreman, President of the South Shore Chamber of Commerce, and I'm pleased to welcome so many people here this morning. I actually felt a little nostalgic coming in at about, I was here about 7:44, which is when we used to kick these off in the old days when people got up early before going into the office, and walked in and thinking, geez, we've had a lot of great events here. And I see a lot of my past chairs who helped organize and speak at those. And we have so many, I thought I'd just call them out since this is the last event of Lombardo's. But I see Jack Spur, Jackie Collins, Ken Quigley, Deirdre Savage, Renee McGinnis, who will be speaking today, George Toma, Paula Harris, Catherine Hesse. Great turnout from past chairs, but probably their last event here. Well, past chairs just rise. You've done so much to help us with all of this. The Lombardos and the Lombardo family have been great to us over the years. And since this is our last farewell to this banquet hall, the Lombardo business is not disappearing, but the banquet hall is closing. So that we can thank the entire family for who knows how many decades of support for the chamber. David Lombardo, come on up and tell us what you're going to do. Good stage back.
Hi, everybody.
To extend the applause.
Had to do it. Thank you guys all for coming today for breakfast once again. The South Shore Chamber has been a part of our family here for over 40 years. You guys actually got us started. My uncle, my father, my grandfather sat down with the chamber when we came out this way, and you all helped us build this place and make it to what it is and make it part of our family and part of yours. So we want to just take a minute and thank you all so much from the bottom of our heart for being a part of our family, for hosting your events, for having your town's proms and your family's weddings and your corporate events and your galas and your trainings here with us. It's been an honor to serve you for the last 40 years. Our family is not going away. We are just beginning the next phase of what will be an exciting future for the Lombardo Hospitality Group. We've got a few pizza spots on the South Shore, or in Boston right now, one in South Boston, one in Norwood, and more to come called Barto's Bar Pizza. We're going to be transitioning our business to catering. So if you have weddings, if you have corporate events, if you have needs, we'll be here for you. And we hope that you all pick up the phone and call us. And we are still actively looking for a new home to be able to host things like this. So when we find that place, we will make sure to reach out. And so from the bottom of our heart, from the Lombardo family, we just want to thank all of you for your dedication to us, your support of our family, for hosting events here, and just being a part of our community. So thank you. Before you go, our family has a gift for you for all of your hard work. And it's outside in the lobby. It's that giant chandelier. And you just got to figure out how to get that sucker down, and it is yours. And it is a gift from us to you. So we hope you enjoy it in your home, and good luck.
I thought I was going to get a coffee maker because I'm usually in about an hour ahead of time, and Betty's here setting up, and she'll let me run back and get coffee. But thank you. We've had so many political leaders who have been in this room speaking, and one sad thing about Lombardo's closing is there are at least 2 future congressmen, governors, or senators here in the room who won't be able to speak at a South Shore Chamber event here at Lombardo's. State Rep Matt Muratori and Senator Don Kuhn. And and two former public officials who figured out they never were going to become U.S. senators or governor, Vinnie DiMatteo and Joe Sullivan. A program note. The program, there is a lot of meat to this program. That's why it's running a little longer than many of our events. There's a lot to take in. The slide deck, Mark will be talking us through it. The slide deck will be available later this afternoon. We will be emailing everybody who at least registered and gave us their email addresses and giving you a link to that. If you actually snuck in off the street because traffic is bad and you're looking for hot coffee, you're getting intrigued by the slides, give us the email on your way out, and we'll be glad to send that. You know, Ruberto's leaving. It's just a sign of time of changes. A lot of new people. A lot of my past chairs heard David and said, "Who's he? What Ruberto is he? I don't know him. He's been passed down." They all remember the other relative, Vinnie, in the back corner. Vinnie, we got to say thank you to you. But I saw coming in this morning a couple of our new CEOs who both are from outside the area. Jeff Tangle from Rock Trust and Lynch from Atlantic Symphony Orchestra taking over their organizations in the last year. We're going to be talking about change this morning. So I'm kind of curious, just by a show of hands, how many of you are new to your current organization within the last year? Yeah. Really? Not as many as I would have thought. That's interesting, because we are seeing a lot of that change. You know, about 8 years ago, we undertook an ambitious project to look at the region. There was about 30 or 40 leaders of the chamber, business leaders on the South Shore, who helped us take a look at post-Greenbush completion. Where was the South Shore heading? What was our economy like? It was a project headed up by three tribe chairs, Bob Rivers from Eastern Bank, and Quigley, once at Curry College, and Carol Bowman, still with Conway Company, tri-chaired this project, which led to our South Shore 2030 report. That report and economic analysis led to our multi-year initiative around housing, which has seen some success. That success has led us to now a new initiative around water resources, which you'll be hearing a lot more about in the next few years. And we are leading a project looking at some specific business sectors on the South Shore, which you'll hear about during the We've found the most important strategy to economic health for a region, though, is to constantly look at where we are and how we help influence the future. That means taking stock of where we are and some of the assumptions we made in our initial 2030 report. And that's what the South Shore, what is this about? The State of the South Shore event is for, to be able to annually look at some of those assumptions we made 8 years ago or even 2 years ago and see where we are. So I particularly want to thank our sponsors for this new annual event. Crocker Design, A.W. Perry, MountainOne, RIW, Ruberto, Israel, Weiner, Time and Sons. And our lead sponsor for this event is Abington Bank. And so to introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to introduce the President and CEO of Abington Bank, Andy Rustin.
Wow, look at this room. It's amazing, and a long time coming, that we're finally able to get this many people together. I just can't believe you all showed up to see me introduce the keynote speaker. My mother would have been so proud. But we've got a lot of important topics to talk about today, and mainly we're going to be talking about change. And I'm looking to learn from a lot of experts today about what changes we can anticipate coming up. But before we get into that, before I introduce our keynote speaker, I just wanted to share with you some changes that I've seen during my 40-year career. I know you find it hard to believe that I'm old enough to have been in banking for 40 years, but believe it or not, time flies when you're having fun. Right now, things are a little less fun. It's a challenge out there. And we're going to learn about looking into the future and changes in economic conditions and changes in worldwide conditions and how things can perhaps be looked forward to and how things can't be predicted. I've always been a believer. I'm not an economist. I'm not someone that can project and forecast. My background is I am a planner, I am a preparer, and I am a reactor. But I don't know how to look into the future. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know who amongst us could have predicted COVID. Who amongst us could have predicted the wars we're seeing internationally? Who amongst us could have predicted the unspeakable domestic violence that we are seeing today? Who amongst us would have predicted AI? And who amongst us would have predicted what's gone on in crypto? I know for one, I'm not that good at predicting. I've seen a lot of changes in the industry. As I said, I've been here for 40 years. When I got in the banking industry as a CEO, I was a relatively young person. I was 39 years old. And I remember going to my first CEO banking event. And I walked into a room like this. It was at the Fairmount in Boston. And I looked around the room and I said, holy smokes, who are all these old people? Well, I used to make fun of those old people when I was a young, up-and-coming, somebody that wanted to climb the ladder. Well, turn the page. I'm that guy now. I'm the guy that the younger people in the room are pointing at saying, wow, look at that relic, look at that dinosaur. I went to a Mass Bankers CEO conference down at Cape earlier this year, and some of my colleagues who were the same age or about as I am, we kind of looked around the room because there's the younger group of CEOs that are kind of taking over. Our demographic is shrinking, their demographic is growing, and it's time for us to make room for the new ideas and the new ways of doing things and the new people. And I'm really excited to listen and learn today all about it. Some additional changes I've seen. When I got into this business 40-ish years ago, the 30-year fixed rate residential loan was at 15.5%. And nobody ever thought it would go below 10. If you told somebody they'd get a 10% mortgage, they'd have kissed you on the cheek and said, thank you very much. Well, recently, the 30-year fixed rate mortgage is at 8%. And people are not happy because we've seen interest rates be so low for so long. Unfortunately, what that's doing is having a negative impact on our younger people. Housing affordability has doubled in the last 24 months. It's at the affordability levels are at the lowest level in 40 years. These are real serious problems, but additionally, I'm still hearing anecdotal stories about younger people trying to buy their first homes, and they're paying way over asking price. And are they really strapping themselves to expenses that are going to hurt them in the long term? I don't know. I can't look into the future. But we're going to learn a lot. I'm really looking forward to it. So I need to pay attention to my script now. Peter was kind enough yesterday to provide me with some background remarks. And I took a couple of hours to kind of put them in my own voice and write them and rewrite them. Then I woke up real early this morning and I said, oh my God, that's awful. So I said, I'm not good at reading from a script. I just want to speak from the heart. So I do have to revert to the script now because this is the important part. I am a UMass Dartmouth grad, except when I went there it was called SMU. And I'm pleased to see that our keynote speaker today is part of the UMass Donahue Institute. So, find the right page. So here we go. Dr. Mark Melnik is Director of Economic and Public Policy Research at UMass Dartmouth Institute. Mark is a recognized expert in demographic, socio-economic, and labor market issues. So even though I am a UMass Dartmouth grad, my credentials pale in comparison to Mark. Mark believes that population, housing, and demographics are very important in shaping local economies and communities. So please join me in giving a warm South Shore welcome to Dr. Mark Melnik.
You guys hear me okay? Great. I have this professorial kind of walk around like talk kind of thing, so you guys gonna have to put up with that. I'm Mark Melnik. I direct the Economic and Public Policy Research Group at the UMass Donahue Institute. I want to thank Peter and the South Shore folks for inviting me to be here today and give you guys a little presentation on what my staff and I affectionately refer to as the Roadshow. I also felt nostalgic rolling in today because when I pulled into Lombardo's, I'm like, oh, right, this place. And I remembered the last time I was here was January 30th, 2020. And I remember usually at the end of the calendar year, the beginning of the new calendar year, it's kind of like talk season for me because I get tapped by different regional chambers and different groups to come and talk about the economy and what the outlook is. And I said to my staff when I came here that morning, I was like, man, the roadshow is getting really boring. I feel like I'm just saying the same stuff all the time. And so be careful what you wish for, because 6 weeks later, nothing was the same. The roadshow changed dramatically over the next couple of years. So it is really fun to be here today and talk with you all about what's been going on in the state economy over the last few years, what's going on in the South Shore, and what the outlook is going forward. I think this is a really important time to be future focused as we think about the economy. You know, we spent a lot of time in crisis, and that crisis unveiled a lot of things that were important from a public policy perspective, especially vulnerable populations, who is most vulnerable and what vulnerability looks like in Massachusetts. But now that we sit here in 2023, we're post-COVID. The economy has changed in some important ways. There's some important question marks about what the economy looks like in the future, including some of the things that were raised just a few moments ago about AI and this kind of stuff. But we know remote work and just the different parts of vulnerability really kind of showing themselves in new ways. Separate from that, the state's currently doing its economic development plan. Every 4 years, the state is required to create an economic development plan and have it approved by the legislature. This year, I actually was invited by folks from the state to go to the different regional listening sessions and talk about what's been going on in the economy. And rather than, kind of a rubber stamp exercise, it's really a thoughtful time to be thinking, like, hey, what does 2050 look like for the state? How does Massachusetts stay competitive? What are the challenges that we have? The quality of life in Massachusetts is among the best in the nation. And we have a really wonderful and diverse economy. But that experience isn't evenly felt throughout the state. And we have some significant competitiveness issues that we need to wrestle with. And so that's really kind of the story that I'm going to talk about as I go through this. There's a little bit of eating your vegetables when I come and talk about things with folks, lots of graphics and what have you, but I'll point to what's most interesting, and as Peter already said, the slides will be shared afterwards. So this first thing that I have up here is what we call Massachusetts at a glance, and this really provides some of the really high-level overviews of what we see happening in the state economy right now. First thing that's probably most important is our unemployment rate. Right now, the Massachusetts unemployment rate sits at 2.6%. It's the lowest all time, and ninth lowest in the nation right now. And if you would have said to me 2 years ago that we were going to have historically low unemployment rate at the end of 2023, I would not have believed you. But it's interesting to kind of reflect back on what a self-imposed recession looks like and what those impacts are on the general population. The other thing that we like to look at when we think about the health of the economy, though, is what we call the U6 unemployment. That's that second number there, 6.3. U6 unemployment considers both folks who are unemployed and looking for work, as well as folks who are part-time but would like to work full-time. The U6 right now is at 6.3%, puts us kind of middle of the pack in the US. And the reason why we track this is it's a good measure of economic health. When the Great Recession happened, unemployment was coming down, but U6 was really stubborn and high. So what we were seeing was a lot of job creation that was part-time. And so when people were like, oh, it's a jobless recovery that you heard a lot during the Great Recession, that's what that U6 story was kind of telling. Here, U6 has been coming down pretty good, so another good indicator. Massachusetts population has declined almost a percentage point over the last 2 years. It's a really important and interesting trend when we think about what's happening in our state right now. About a year ago, when I was giving this talk, that number there was actually 7.4. The Massachusetts population had grown 7.4% between 2010 and 2020. That was right on line with the US average, the fastest in New England. We've been the fastest growing state in New England for several decades. But over the last 2 years, we've seen population losses in the state, particularly as it relates to domestic out-migration. I'm sure you guys saw a lot of news stories about that back in December when the census numbers had come out. I'm going to talk about that in detail a little bit later, with some really important issues about broader competitiveness in our state that public policy makers need to be paying attention to. Over the last year, we've grown our jobs 2.5%. That ranks us 9th in the nation. That's good. And then a couple of important demographic characteristics. 18% of Massachusetts is foreign-born. That's the 7th highest in the nation. The recent history of the economy in Massachusetts is an immigrant story. Since 1980, since 1990, 80% of labor force growth in Massachusetts has been because of the gains in immigrant labor. So the growth in our state is so closely tied with the growth of the foreign-born population. Poverty is 10.4% in Massachusetts, 9th lowest in the nation. Poverty is a very crude measure of relative economic deprivation. It is not a great measure when we think about our state, because it does not take into account the cost of living differences between states. Poverty line is the same everywhere. So the experience of people here would look different than folks in Ohio. And I'll touch on that a little bit more. Median age is 40.3. We're the 17th oldest state in the country. So we're talking about all the old dinosaurs and what have you. It's not it's not an accident. It's part of the changing demographics of our state in several states. And we have the most well-educated state in the country. 47% of Massachusetts has a college degree. So this next graphic here looks at the industries in Massachusetts compared to the US, and it's obviously hard to look at in a room like this, but what I want to call people's attention to are just where our relative strengths are compared to the US. Oh, it does, great. All right, so anywhere, Mass is in the red, US is in the yellow. And I think the thing I want to highlight here is just these handful of industries that we have a relative concentration of relatively compared to the U.S. So healthcare and social assistance, for example. 20% of jobs in Massachusetts are in this industry, right? That's been an area of strength of ours for a while. It includes hospitals. It also includes other forms of social assistance like drug rehabilitation, retirement communities, and so on. That's been a strength of ours for a long time. And a strength of the South Shore, which I'll touch on in a little bit. The other thing that's been really important in our state is this kind of clunky name, professional, scientific, and technical services. This includes a lot of knowledge-based sectors in the economy, like high-tech, bio, and so on. It's been a really significant strength in Massachusetts for a long time. 11% of our jobs in Massachusetts are in professional, scientific, and technical services. And interestingly, while it's the second largest industry in the state now, it was the 5th largest just 10 years ago. So big changes just in the last handful of years in the growth of this sector. Obviously, education services, I wouldn't be surprised to see that ranked high. And then retail as well, which is high also in the US. And then we kind of look like the US on most other things, but I really want to call out this professional, scientific, and technical thing. All right, so this next graphic here is per capita income. I love, data got updated, so it ruined the shock and awe of this statement, but it's still pretty close. Massachusetts is the second richest state in the country. A year ago this time, we were the richest state, but Connecticut passed us by like $30. But our per capita income is 30% higher in Massachusetts than the nation. Per capita income in Mass is about $85,000 compared to $65,000 in the US. In a longer presentation, I have a follow-up slide here that shows the differences in per capita income in the state. And just want to highlight here is that while we see this here as having high per capita income, there are stark differences by race when we look at per capita income in the state. Now, of course, course, you're all sitting there and you're thinking, I live in the second richest state in the country. Why don't I feel that rich? Well, the reason is that we have the 5th most expensive childcare, the 4th most expensive electricity, the 3rd most expensive natural gas, the 5th highest home prices, and the 2nd worst traffic. So all of that sounds familiar to you all, right? So these are some of the challenges that we face when we think about broad quality of life in Massachusetts. Okay, so this next graphic looks at the history of unemployment in the state dating back to the mid-70s. And obviously a lot of, eat your vegetables in here. But what I want to call people's attention to are a couple things. And first, let's orient. Massachusetts is the red, the US is the yellow. These gray bars that we see here are recessions, and the thickness of the gray bar is how long that recession took place. So the Great Recession stands out here because it's the thickest bar. The COVID recession is actually quite short, right? And what I want to highlight here is kind of how the Massachusetts economy separates from the US economy over time, and most notably in this millennium. As we see the kind of the makeup of the economy change and knowledge sectors really emerge as kind of the leading sectors in the state, Massachusetts' unemployment rate separates from the US. So, and in particular, we see it in the Great Recession, right? So, Great Recession happens. Our mix of industries in the state proved to be a little more resilient than the nation's. The industries that were hurt really bad during the Great Recession were things like construction, manufacturing, retail. And while we have all those things in Massachusetts, we also have more sectors that would be thought of as kind of recession-proof, like higher ed or healthcare and so on. And we did better in the Great Recession. And then we see the separation over time that occurs. And throughout the entire recovery period of after the Great Recession, our unemployment rate is significantly lower than the US. And then COVID happens, and boom. And so when I was giving these talks in my house, in my pajamas, pajama bottoms, I had the shirt on, but it felt like the apocalypse, right? Because the unemployment rate jumps off the page, and there's no end in sight, right? We had the highest unemployment rate in the nation for a little while in 2020. Part of this is because the northeastern part of the U.S. was hit hardest by COVID early on. And so Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, these states all had early outbreaks of COVID. Unemployment went through the roof in these states. We also had some pretty strong social distancing policies in Massachusetts. Our unemployment goes really high. Since then, it's come down dramatically. We're now down to 2.6, over a percentage point below the U.S. at 3.8. So things are looking pretty good there. Now, looking at jobs recovery, this next graphic shows the number of jobs lost from our pre-pandemic peak, and then how far we were from that pre-pandemic peak until it kind of flips over. So for example, at a trough, we had lost 682,000 jobs in Massachusetts, and this is April 2020. And then this is every month going ahead. And we're negative, 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 and then here in March of this year, we flip over to having more jobs now than we did pre-pandemic. So that's been most of this year. Now, how does that compare to the rest of the U.S.? Pretty average. And there's a few reasons for that. We are 34th in terms of jobs recovery. A lot of states are in this kind of 100 to like 101 range, but we're kind of in the middle of the pack. And part of the reason for that is, despite some of the positive indicators I highlighted before, some of the demographic things that are kind of slowing economic growth and will continue to slow economic growth going forward for the state. This graphic we developed during the COVID crisis to kind of highlight the winners and losers in jobs recovery. It's our barbell graphic. To orient folks to this, the yellow is the number of jobs that industry lost in COVID. And then the red is the number of jobs they recovered, okay? So in the instances where the yellow is to the right of the red, it's an industry with fewer jobs today than there was pre-pandemic. In the instances where their red is to the right of the yellow, it's an industry that's bigger today. And so I just want to call your attention to three things. One, when we first came up with this graphic, this section was way bigger, and this section was way smaller. So now we just have a few industries that have fewer jobs today than we had pre-pandemic, but some in really acute ways. Leisure and hospitality lost 226,000 jobs. And while it has recovered over 200,000, there's still a gap of 25,000 jobs in leisure and hospitality in Massachusetts. Retail, a gap of about 20,000 jobs. professional business services, that one I highlighted a little bit earlier, they lost 55,000 jobs early in the pandemic. That sector turned around and gained 105,000. So it's a sector that blew up dramatically over those next couple of years. Now, despite the fact that some industries are still lagging, one of the important things I want to highlight is that this is talking about 3 years of jobs recovery. This graphic here is talking about the last year. So some of these sectors that I was highlighting as kind of struggling are actually doing quite well now. So leisure and hospitality in Massachusetts in the last year has actually grown 5.5%. So an important thing is that, you know, this slide we could give a negative impression that some industries are continuing to struggle, but we've seen recovery in a lot of different places as well as in like retail. Okay, during the COVID crisis, during the Great Recession, one of the things that we like to track was the way jobs recovered around the state. And we had a real lagging job recovery in the places outside of 495, particularly as you get further west of Massachusetts. This graphic considers that same concept now in the COVID recovery. Things look fairly even. So the Worcester MSA, Barnstable, Springfield, Boston, they're all kind of right where they were pre-pandemic, right? I think most interestingly is Pittsfield far west is way behind where they were at their jobs peak in 2020. Okay, one of the things that we do at the Donahue Institute is we produce a journal called Mass Benchmarks. Smash that subscribe button. We come out with a few products a year, a journal twice a year on we're taking nerd economic stuff and translating it to a more lay audience. We do quarterly releases on the state of the economy from our board, as well as an index release. This is the index release. The index release compares the change in gross domestic product in Massachusetts to the US, and then projects out what we expect to happen in the future. What's important to highlight here is just how that red bar here compares to that yellow bar. We're looking at 2022 here and into 2023, and there's been this drumbeat of like, when's the recession coming? When's the recession coming? When's the recession coming? And this surprise when the new data come out as the economy continues to chug along. And Massachusetts stands out in that regard. Last quarter, we grew 4% in gross domestic product ahead of the US. Part of that is because we have highly productive industries in our state. We have high wage industries in the knowledge sector, so that ends up being highly productive in the economy. Interestingly, a technical way to define a recession, one of the technical ways, is 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. Well, that actually happened. It happened right here. Now, the way recessions are officially determined is that there's a group of economists, and they get in a room, and then they do like this white smoke thing. I think it's in Cambridge, actually, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and that's when the recession is declared for everybody, and it's usually after the fact. But there's a quantitative way recessions are defined, and then there's a qualitative way. So while we did have 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth, we also had jobs gaining during that time period and low unemployment. So it was never called a recession at the time. Now, looking ahead to the rest of the year, we are actually projecting slowing economic growth in the state. And a lot of that is because of demographic reasons and changes in our workforce. Massachusetts labor force is actually smaller today than it was pre-pandemic. So there were a lot of dumb stories in the recovery during the pandemic of saying that people just don't want to work, people don't want to work. And while it may have been true in some anecdotal cases, in reality what was happening is that we just have fewer workers now than we had pre-pandemic. Now some of that is people dropping out of the labor force. We see this here. This is the C-session that people talked about a lot, where the labor force participation rate of the state plummets early in the pandemic, right? And then it recovers over the next several months. You can actually plot when schools reopen with the labor force participation rate, both when they reopen in the fall of 2020 and then when in-person schooling really kicks back up again in the springtime of 2021. But as we fast forward to today, our labor force participation rate is generally similar to what it was pre-pandemic, but the number of workers is smaller. We've had 100,000 fewer workers in the state than we did pre-pandemic. Now, one of the other things we do at the Donahue Institute is we produce population projections for all the cities and towns in Massachusetts. And this is a kind of a crude analysis that we did recently. You take the The change in labor force size in Massachusetts from 1990 to 2020, Massachusetts labor force grew about 15%. If you take population projections that we have at the Donahue Institute for 2020 to 2050 and apply current day labor force participation rates to that age and gender makeup for the state, our labor force only grows 7%. Why is that happening? Well, that's because of how old we're getting. It's because of the dinosaurs in the room, right? This is what we typically call an age pyramid. On the left is the age pyramid. This is the age distribution of Massachusetts in 2020. And on the right is the projected age distribution for Massachusetts in 2050. It's not a pyramid anymore, it's a big old rectangle. What ends up happening? Well, here, today, 17% of Massachusetts is 65 or over. We project in 2050 that 27% of Massachusetts will be 65 or over. When you take in that, and labor force participation declines dramatically age 65 and above, right? So this is where you start running into these problems about having enough labor to fill critical job vacancies in the state. Okay, a couple other things I want to touch on. This is my absolute favorite graphic we do at the Donahue Institute because it highlights so many interesting things about Massachusetts and how we've changed over the last couple of decades. And this is the components of population change. Inside of this, we can highlight things about the workforce stuff I just talked about, as well as some of the changing racial dynamics in the state. So first, let me take this in pieces. This is the components of population. This is a natural change, so this is birth, the blue line, and the yellow is death. We see that these two lines are converging and coming closer to one another. This is a function of being an older state. This is a function of being a well-educated state. This is a function of having well-educated women with high labor force participation. Delays family formation, family sizes are smaller. What also happens is we saw death increase a bit in 2020, global pandemic, and we saw births come down. So while there were a lot of dum-dum stories in 2020 that we're going to have all these pandemic babies in 9 months, those could only have been in families that didn't have any children already because I couldn't be alone with my wife for a while. But in reality, families don't have babies during economic crisis, right? So we see these two lines converging. So our natural increase is really kind of slow. So what's the other parts of our interesting change? There's our domestic migration, and this is the thing that got all the attention last year. We have been net losers in domestic migration in Massachusetts for years. And I think it's important here to talk about signal and noise. Let me come back to that signal and noise thing here. We've been net losers of domestic migration for years, but what really got a lot of attention from people recently has been this dramatic increase in domestic out-migration last year. In a normal year in Massachusetts, we would lose about 30,000 residents per year to domestic out-migration. Last year, we lost 60,000, and the media lost their mind. And this is important to highlight signal and noise here. I think this is noise. I think that there's some weird stuff about COVID that's showing itself right here. And I don't think 60,000 is necessarily the new normal. But the signal is the losing people. We've been losing people for a long time. And there's a concentration in who we lose. And it highlights an important public policy issue that we face in the state. And what's counteracted this domestic out-migration has been the international in-migration. And so here's that line of immigrants, right? And so again, on the racial dynamic that I mentioned before, Mass has become progressively less white over time. And a big part of that is because of the increase in Hispanic and Asian folks in the state. And that's this international piece here. Now, starting in 2017, we see the amount of international migrants in the state slow down. Some of this are federal policies from the Trump administration. Some of this, I think, is kind of just the rhetoric around immigration in the state. But most importantly, a global pandemic stops immigration in 2020 and 2021. So some of the labor shortages we see now are tied to that. And then in this last year, international migration comes back to normal, right? Not enough to counterbalance the losses from domestic out-migration. So this is that whole dynamic that you're seeing. South Shore looks a little different if we focus on South Shore. Kind of like the state, but South Shore is older, right? We knew older folks were more negatively impacted during the COVID crisis. Check that out. Check that out. 2020 and 2021, what happens to death here? Compared to that, and then death and birth kind of comes back together. We have these for every county in the state, and they're mind-blowing. To look at the Cape and domestic in-migration in 2021, just jumping off the page and then coming back to normal. The Hampshire County, where UMass is, this kind of, everybody get the hell out of here. Like all this domestic out-migration, and everybody come back. So there's a lot of artifacts in here that COVID creates that are weird. But I think it's interesting here to see this dynamic, and I think the domestic out-migration thing. South Shore has actually done okay with domestic out-migration. And I think in part because it's an older area, it's a little bit more affluent. You have a lot of folks who might be younger living in Greater Boston, moving to the South Shore over time. But there was some significant out-migration around the COVID period, and what happens going forward will be important. So who are the movers, right? This here is a little complicated to look at, but I'll walk you through it. These are age groups in Massachusetts, and the percentages here, the percent that age group makes up in the state. These are in migrants, people who move in, and these are out migrants, people who move out. And what I think is really interesting is to consider the ways in which the in and out migrants concentration by age looks different than the total population, right? So let me give you an example. 25 to 34-year-olds in Massachusetts make up 14.1% of the state. But for in migrants, they make up 27% of the state. And for out migrants, they make up 30% of the state, okay? Similarly, 18 to 24 makes up 10% of Massachusetts, but 38% of our in migrants, 26% of our out. It's not shocking. This is college kids, right? What I think is really important here is this dynamic. We have a lot of out migration for these 25 to 34-year-olds. This is one of the reasons why I keep hammering on the housing cost issues. Because this is the kind of thing, like you're early in your career, you're trying to get settled, and how do you get settled? In a place where it costs $160,000 for a down payment to buy a house or what have you. And then we do have some significant out-migration for 0 to 17s, right? But of course, that's a population that's leaving with these people, right? So anyway, important point to make. A couple other dynamics here by the counties, like what's been happening. I'll call out your guys' counties here. We've got Plymouth and Norfolk. Plymouth did pretty well in population gain in 2020 and then kind of flat in 2021. Norfolk lost a little population in 2020 and kind of flattened out. And that's kind of the case for the whole state. Suffolk was crazy. Lost a ton of people in 2020. Actually kind of normalized last year. Middlesex kind of the same. And then you can kind of see Barnstable here. Gained a ton of people between 2020 and 2021. Okay, a few other interesting things. 18.4% of Massachusetts works remotely right now. That's sixth highest, excuse me, in the state and nation, compared to 15.2 nationally. Here is the comparison for some of the different cities and towns in Massachusetts in their remote work. Not surprisingly, some of our more affluent suburban communities have higher remote work, like Newton, 33%. People make a lot about how, oh, well, you can live anywhere and work remote. But interestingly, in Massachusetts, those folks who are most apt to be working remote are ones living in the most affluent suburbs. So it wasn't this flood of people moving to Pittsfield because it's cheaper there. Okay, housing cost burdens. Is something we talk about a lot in public policy circles. That's when families pay 30% or more of their income on housing. Massachusetts has higher housing cost burdens than the rest of the nation. Our renters, 53% are housing cost burden, which looks similar in the US, but a little elevated. For owners, 30% are housing cost burden. And for owners without a mortgage, it's 20%. How are you housing cost burden and not have a mortgage? Well, this includes your utilities and your taxes. You think about older folks who are maybe on a fixed income. They can own their house outright, but they still owe something every month. So we see that dynamic here. And this is extreme housing cost burden, where folks are spending 50% or more of their income on housing. And that's a quarter of all renters in Massachusetts, and it's elevated for owners in the state as well. So from a policy perspective, and I know Peter in their group has focused a lot with the housing agenda, housing. That is such a big problem in Massachusetts. Even with losing population recently, it's an important issue because the makeup of households has changed, the needs of households have changed, just do not have enough housing in Massachusetts, and it makes it really hard for people to make ends meet in the state. One of my favorite anecdotes just from my own life is, I'm from Northeast Ohio, I'm a big Cleveland Cavaliers fan. When I bought my house in Natick in 2018, it was the same time that Kyrie Irving sold his house in Cleveland after he got traded to the Celtics. He sold his mansion in Cleveland for $50,000 less than my house in Natick. And they are not remotely the same. Okay, housing cost burdens around the state too. It's a little less problematic here in the South Shore area, much more elevated in Suffolk County, but still high. A couple things about South Shore. Unemployment rate is 2.4%. We're still about 3,400 jobs behind where we were pre-pandemic. The region has grown slightly, and I highlighted that a little bit on the last slides. And job growth has been a little slower than the state at 1%. There's a significant foreign-born population down here, 16.1%. It's an interesting mix of communities, as you guys are all aware. Places like Quincy, Quincy have is 33% foreign-born. Poverty rate is low, 7%, but we have gateway cities in the region as well. So places like Brockton is 12% poverty rate. And it is an old area. Median ages of 41 and 43. A lot of those with college degree, 51%. Couple comparison points. This is a region that's actually grown population more robustly than the rest of the state. This is indexed to 2010, and the green line is South Shore. We see this kind of significant gain in population recently compared to Massachusetts. Similarly, employment's been a little stronger in the South Shore than the state. It's an area that's a little white. Massachusetts is 70% white, 78% white on the South Shore. And a big part of that is a much larger Hispanic population living in other parts of the state. This next graphic looks at the mix of industries in the South Shore compared to Massachusetts, both in 2010 and 2020. And I think probably what's most interesting here, healthcare and social assistance continues to be important in both. It's the industry of strength for South Shore, also is over here. But also for South Shore, which stands out is its strengths in retail, which was the case in 2010 as well as 2020. And there's this lag in professional and business services, which I highlighted before. Back in 2010, 8% of the jobs in Massachusetts were in professional and technical services, and it's 11% today. And then when you look at the South Shore, it's only 5% a decade ago, and it's 6% now, right? So it's really kind of a lagging sector here, but a lot of strengths, again, in retail and healthcare. South Shore is an interesting place because it serves as somewhat of a bedroom community. This graphic here, this is data from 2020 and the data series that the census comes out with called On the Map. It's really interesting stuff. Unfortunately, it has data lag to it. So the most recent data is 2020. So I take it with the appropriate amount of salt that goes with these things right now when you're looking at 2020 data. But this was also the case when I came here in 2020 and showing you guys 2018 data, where you had a significant outflow of people who live here to Boston to work. And we still see that with 26% of workers in the region. So I think transportation is also an important issue when we think about South Shore. Now, the age dynamic in South Shore is worse than the state. If you're already older when it comes to median age, what happens to the age pyramid? Well, in 2020, 19% of South Shore is 65 or over. But when you use the same model I used earlier talking about the state, the population projections for the state, 33% of the South Shore is going to be 65 or over by 2050. So this presents that same labor force challenge for the region that I talked about for the state, but a little bit more acutely. Between 1990 and 2020, the labor force in this region grew 18.3%. But the labor force in 2020 to 2050 will likely only grow about 3% because of that age dynamic. So one of the things I hit on when I'm talking about policy with folks in the state is how to make Massachusetts the most competitive place it can be for folks to live and to work. How to make Massachusetts an easier place to work. So part of this is attracting and retaining people, our college students, our young families, getting them to stay here, making housing affordable. But it's also a workforce development issue. Because how do we make it easier to work for folks who have lower labor force participation rates than typical. For example, folks with a criminal record, folks who are with disabilities, folks with limited educational attainment. I think an all-in strategy is necessary for this state going forward for us to think about how to make us optimally competitive. Because if we can move the needle on those populations that are participating in labor force 50%, and you move to 55, how much more labor do you shake out, right? And I think those are the kinds of strategies we need to be thinking about. So it's building housing, it's workforce development, and it's about lowering the costs for businesses and families so that this state continues to maintain the high quality of life standard that we've had for the last several decades. I fear I probably went too long, but I was having fun. And I'll stop there, and we'll happy to take questions about it.
All right, no, that's not on. Okay. We will have a Q&A period. There are index cards on the table. If you have questions for Mark or any of our panelists in a few minutes, just write them down, we'll collect them, and then our facilitator, Rich Fernandez, chairman of the board, will try to get through those as much as possible. We want to take Mark's presentation, which again will be available later on because there was a lot of material there. But start looking at a couple of business sectors and give kind of a local interpretation of what some of this means. So we've got an interesting panel to come and do that. So if the panelists would come up and take a seat as we rearrange the stage. Eileen McEnany is a senior fellow of economic opportunity at Pioneer Institute and the principal of EPM Consulting. Formerly spent many years as president of Mass Taxpayers Foundation and was with Associated Industries of Mass. Renee McInnes, president of Norwell DNA and our past chair, and she is co-chairing with Peter Savage a project at the Chamber looking at the health business sector. And then Karina Donoso is vice president of retail experience and incubation at WS Development. Locally, you all know that on the South Shore as Derby Street Shops. And she co-hosts a podcast for WS Development, The Retail Darwin. She herself was a retail entrepreneur before that, co-founding her own business. And then moderating this panel discussion is our current chairman of the board of the chamber and president of the Open, Rich Fernandez.
You don't have got a mic, I think.
You guys have right.
Can you hear me? Am I good now? He told me to make sure I talk really loud. He can turn my voice down, but he can't really turn it up. So I'm Rich Fernandez. I'm the president of VID Nolan Hospital and have the honor of hosting this panelist discussion. But I do have a question for Mark before we get going, because you explained that unemployment with the, what was it, the U6 thing?
Yep.
And those are people that are either unemployed or part-time and want to work?
Yes, one word full time.
Great. Can I give you my number? We need to have an 800 number for those folks. They can get a job anywhere in healthcare. I'm sure Renee would hire them. I would hire them. I'm sure one of you would want. But I don't know where those people are, but have them give our number.
Well, it's interesting, in a longer version of my presentation too, I have some data on the unemployment differences by demographics. So there's significantly higher unemployment for Black and brown folks. There's significantly higher unemployment for folks without a college degree. So even though the unemployment rate is quite low in the state, there is this disconnect, I think, between the jobs that are available, what the requirements might be for them, and the folks who are actually available to work. So, which highlights workforce development issues.
That's what I was thinking of ties into. So great. So as Peter said, there are, you can raise your hand for questions, you can write them on the table, and we can get them up here. But before we get into questions, I kind of, as Peter said, there are different people representing different sectors. So what I was hoping is, each of you, this is not a dissertation, this is not a speech, this is an introduction soundbite piece. So maybe 5 minutes or so we can keep this thing moving. So Eileen, I want to just, Mark has kind of set the table with a lot of data information. I know you spent a lot of time looking at Massachusetts and our competitiveness. What's your take on the broader Massachusetts economy, how do we become more competitive? How do we become more competitive here in the South Shore?
All right, I don't know if I can answer that in 5 minutes, but I'll do my best. Before I delve into my remarks, though, I do want to thank Peter Foreman for having us in Mark, or Dr. Melnik, for an incredibly informative presentation. And so he honestly covered a lot of what I would have raised, but I want to make 5 quick points and underscore some of the data. So first, I think the good news is the South Shore is doing better than the nation, than Massachusetts as a whole on a relative basis, in that you have lower poverty, lower unemployment, and higher educational attainment, right? So that's the good news and something to build upon. I think the growth sectors for many may seem like a good thing in health and social services and education because many people see them as recession-proof. For me, it's a red flag because I think healthcare and education are paid increasingly, either directly or indirectly, with government funds. And to the extent you don't have a robust economy or a big tax base, those things can be jeopardized. The other thing I would say is certainly folks who utilize education services, at least traditional ones, are shrinking in number, right? So that's an industry that may over time not see the growth. And in healthcare, I think it's part and parcel of an aging population. As we age, we tend to use more healthcare. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's profitable healthcare, particularly if it's in nursing homes. So I think we have to unpack some of that a little and better understand it. The other thing I would say is the other sector that's growing is professional services. And again, that seems a natural fit given our highly educated population, but they're also the most mobile, right? They're not tethered to Massachusetts the way they were before the pandemic. And so I think we have to be careful about that because the other demographic that looks like they're leaving are the people who are 20, I think it's 25 to 34, the people who are trying to buy a house and can't. But many of them are professional, and so they may be able to work elsewhere. And to me, I think that's something we have to be paying attention to. The other thing is certainly talent is the calling card. I think it's something we have to focus on. I think it's across the board. It doesn't matter what industry. I think we have to think about creative ways to keep people in the workforce, particularly retirees, whether it's flexible work schedules, part year, or something. Teenagers too. They're not participating in the workforce in the way they once did, and I think we have to think about ways to try to entice them. The only other thing I would say is I think our cost structure underlies a lot of what we're talking about, and I'm very happy to hear Governor Healy talking about affordability, competitiveness, equity. To me, I think the more important conversation is what does that mean? How do we peel that back and talk about that? And I think competitiveness is a real issue for Massachusetts because a lot of these numbers don't reflect recent tax changes. One, the income surtax that will drive high income earners potentially out of Massachusetts. You couple that with a very expensive estate tax, high short-term capital gains. I worry that some of the innovators and entrepreneurs will take their resources elsewhere. And so I don't know if that will impact these demographic trends, but I think it's worth paying really close attention to. And I'll stop there.
That's pretty good, thank you. I think now we have a little perspective. I'm just going to go right in this order. I'm going to jump to Karina. Karina, in the 2030 plan and actually in Mark's data, retail was and still remains a big part of both the Boston and the South Shore economy. Yet I remember going to, I think Hanover Mall's been redeveloped, I think South Shore Mall's been redeveloped. It doesn't kind of jive with what a lot of people do. Can you comment just a little bit on the retail industry? What are you seeing? Kind of how is it evolving?
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack in 5 minutes, so I'm going to do my best. I would say globally, and I think Mark really hit on this, and we're all talking about it in different ways. Generationally, we're all shopping differently because our priorities have shifted quite a bit. And so you have this Gen Z millennial, I'm a millennial, 1987, and what that means is that I don't necessarily want to go shopping at the Gap the same way my mom did. I want an experience. And why do I want an experience? Because I'm on my phone, and this is how I get to people. And so retail right now is undergoing this traumatic effect of how do they connect with some of what is now the biggest economic spending power, which is a much younger generation. By 2030, we're going to make up even more than that. So the way in which retail needs to survive is we need to readapt, and I think that the malls that you mentioned might not be adapting to those things. So WS Development, we're very focused on mixed retail use. So what does that mean? That's we like essential goods. During COVID, we were open for everyone to come take a walk. You could go to Whole Foods. You can still spend your day because we're a community. So we're talking about F&B, restaurants, retail, and we're equipped where WS Development has hired me and my team to make sure that our retailers understand what they need to do and how they're going to have to shift their businesses in order to be successful. So it's not just, it's so much more than just opening up a door now for retailers. They are also not compacted, but they're affected by the way in which this younger generation needs to feel inspired to go to work. Now companies have to invest even more on hourly rates, which are skyrocketed because Massachusetts is some of the highest, as Mark pointed out, expensive places to work. So when I was working part-time when I was 14 and could get working papers, I think I was making $8 an hour. Part-time in Massachusetts, if you work at a retail store in Boston, $18 an hour. 23, goes up to 35 if you want senior management retail. It's expensive. And they also want your company to have sustainability, DEI. Everything has to be so much more than just a store. They have to feel a part of something. So generationally, we are up against great challenges to inspire what is now going to be the biggest generation that's going to shift everyone out of their seats today.
Wow.
Yeah.
Adam, now I feel like a dinosaur.
Do you really?
I love my red Gap sweater. I don't understand why people don't like this anymore.
So people love the Gap, but it's the way in which now the Gap has to meet their new customers. So.
That's great. Renee, my favorite.
First, I just hope that they're ready to take care of me when I'm like as the agent.
Yeah, we are. So Renee, she's my healthcare colleague. I'm a hospital. She's on the other side. We send a lot of business there. But talk about healthcare. Those numbers were huge. And yes, Peter, people over the age of 65 do use more healthcare. So
Yeah.
it's like 30%, you said, Mark, 33% of the population, but South Shore will be, they're going to be in a hospital using healthcare, yet we're not going to have any employees. How do we grapple with that?
Yeah, so I don't know that I can say more than you said, because you really said it all truly, is our biggest fear is the aging population and the workforce, right? So Deirdre Savage and I, my buddy co-chair for the chamber focus groups that we've been doing on healthcare with all healthcare leaders and any other business that's touching us in delivery of care for patients, right? So surprise, surprise, what bubbled up was workforce, increased wages, benefits, as you're talking about, healthcare, the cost of healthcare, how expensive that is. So having competitive salaries. And because healthcare is the largest employer on the South Shore, we are competing. We're all competing. Rich and I fight over the same nurses, right? So we're all competing for the same people, and we're competing with salaries in Boston as well. So there is a huge challenge on who will be caring for people. And when I saw your slides, Mark, I said, wow, you know it, you hear it, but when you see the data and you say, where is this workforce going to be coming from? How are we going to recruit, retain, and entice people to want to do this type of work? I think that the community colleges and the universities play a part in this, and I think they're very instrumental in the state of Massachusetts in helping us figure this out. But I think we have to be bold and we have to be innovative. And we have to look at all of it and what you're talking about as well, which is how are we going to pay for all of this? And what's the consumer's responsibility in all of this as well? So there's a lot of education about healthcare that needs to happen. I think everybody just thinks everything is paid for and I don't need to worry about it, but very expensive. And should we add some competitive ideas in there? I think we should. So I know, Rich, you're passionate about that as well. So I think the challenge is 100% working together. I think now more than ever, I see people willing to collaborate and work together to solve some of these problems, because what lane should I be in and what lane should you be in, and how do we help each other? What's our core business? What are we good at? What are we expert at? And how can we work together as a community to support some of these initiatives and not just think about healthcare in silos, because there is the whole continuum that we need to work together.
Great, thank you, Renee. So let's jump in, let's go back to broader economic. When we first, I think when Peter developed this 2030 plan, one of the key things was about housing. Mark, you pointed that out, how all aspects of housing, how much of a burden it is, whether you're owning, renting, living in a house. Yet the pandemic's kind of turned that upside down. We're one of, would you say, the top 10 in remote work, yet you don't need to live here. We were trying to create housing to bring more businesses. Do we actually need more housing to create more businesses, or how do you do that in the South Shore to make sure we have people here? We know we need them for retail, we know we need them for healthcare, the two biggest drivers, but maybe professional services and others we don't. Why and how? Yeah, either I lead, Mark, because we don't have to go down the thing, but I'm thinking you two might be able to comment on that.
Do you want to start?
Sure. So I think we still need more housing, because if you think about it, and Mark, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but just from a layman's perspective, households are smaller. So I think about, my mother went from her family home to her marital home, right? And that was it. I lived on my own before I got married, and I needed an apartment, right? As do lots of other people who are 25 to 34. So you're seeing different types of households, and we just need more of them, really across the cost spectrum. And I think that that's really important. Certainly need affordable housing, but you need market rate housing for people. And I'll just give one example because I think it highlights everything. So this isn't a South Shore story, it's a North Shore, but the new Encore casino, right? They were looking to hire someone, and the woman who manages it wanted someone from Las Vegas. She knew that Massachusetts was more expensive, so she offered them double the salary they would get in Las Vegas. They came and they looked at housing, and the house that the person could afford was a good hour away, comparable to the house they would have had in Las Vegas, to your point about Ohio and the prices. And so the person didn't take the job because that would have been an hour on a good day, and we all know that the traffic, it might have been more like 2 on many days, was 2 hours more away from his family, and he had a young one, than he wanted to spend. So the point is, it's the cost of housing, it's where the affordable housing is located, it's how you get from point A to point B. We haven't talked about transportation, but that is part and parcel of this conversation. And so I think the short answer is we definitely need more housing across the cost spectrum and different kinds of housing too.
It was funny to hear you mention transportation because that's how Eileen and I first met. We were on the governor's future transportation task force, and just what the transportation challenge is. On housing, we're suffering from a decades-long problem of underproduction. And one of the issues here in Massachusetts has long been that while we all talk about housing, you're basically negotiating with 351 victims in order to create more housing. I was brought in to be a keynote speaker in Amesbury 6 months ago where the town wanted to build more housing, and it's like, okay, can you come in and tell everybody why building more housing is important and da-da-da, and so they come in and do it. We're talking about a town of 10,000 people that's trying to build a few hundred units of housing, and it's like they're playing tug of war, right? And when you think about each one of these instances, you see why we have this challenge. We've underproduced for so long that it's just a broad quality of life issue. So, in terms of like what, if you build it, they will come kind of questions, I think for me, a lot of it just comes down to how to make sure that you're maintaining an adequate quality of life for middle income folks so that Massachusetts is an attractive place to live. The businesses come with that, but I think that's one of the big questions that we need to be asking ourselves. I think there's a lot of sociocultural things about Massachusetts that makes it a very attractive place to live, but that cost thing is the thing that keeps hitting middle income families big way, you know, where, again, you know, I use that example when I bought my house, but my wife and I ended up making the calculation, yeah, but we like living here enough that that's fine, right? But there's some number of people that they don't for that reason, right? And it's a complicated issue because it's like the most valuable thing I'm ever going to give my children is that house, right? So there is that issue where like families are self-interested in lower housing production because that's your own personal wealth. But it is an extraordinarily difficult state to live in if you're low and moderate income because of all of these challenges. So there's the affordable housing, and I think Eileen touched on it a little bit, but housing that is affordable or naturally affordable housing, which is how the market allows for, you know, a family making $100,000 a year to be able to afford a reasonable place to live that's close enough to the amenities that you want. And so we just need to produce more. And it is a decades-long problem, and it's just, we've been kicking the can down the road. Even when we do pretty well, this past decade was actually a pretty decent year of housing production in the state. Still, it's like turning around the battleship compared to like where we've been.
That's great. Any questions from the audience? I got a few good ones right here, so be prepared.
Oh, no.
I bet if I polled people here, I bet 50% of the folks in here would guess this first question, because it's actually, of the questions I've got, it's 2 out of the 4 cards here. And I have a feeling of going back to Mark and Eileen on this one. But we've got to get it out there. So how is the millionaire's tax going to contribute to the outflow of Bostonians and people in Massachusetts?
Do you want to arm wrestle? Or...
Let's go.
How about you go first? Or do you want to respond?
We can go back and forth.
I'm coming back to retail health here, don't worry.
So obviously, different people have different perspective on the income surtax. I think it's problematic for the state for a few reasons, and I mentioned one of them. Who pays the millionaire's tax? People who are small business owners, who are entrepreneurs, who are innovators, right? And they have choices about where they locate businesses. And so, and just I would say anecdotally, I hear it all the time. It's not just the millionaire's tax. It's the, I'll call it trifecta, right? It's the millionaire's tax, it's the estate tax, and even with recent changes in the governor's tax package, Massachusetts still has the most, or among the most onerous estate taxes. And so it's the same people. And thirdly, there's federal, state, local tax, deduction limitation. So as local taxes eat up more, fewer people can deduct. All I'm saying is whether it's right or wrong, whether people should pay more if they make more is kind of, for this conversation, not material. I think the issue is, do people react to tax burdens? And I think the answer is some of them do, not all of them, and it's not always just that single factor. I think it's a number of factors, but I do think, particularly when you think about our demographic, that the population that's growing are the people between 55 and 65. I'm one of them, thinking about where do I retire? Where do I buy a second home if I'm lucky enough to be able to? And the answer increasingly is not in Massachusetts. And so I just think we have to worry. And why we have to worry is because those people, the millionaires, or the people in the top quintile of taxpayers, the top 20%, pay about 70% of all the income taxes in Massachusetts, and it's the biggest source of tax revenue for the Commonwealth. So you lose some of them. You lose a big chunk of your tax base, which doesn't allow you to fund healthcare increasingly, or higher education, or student loans, or a whole host of other things. And so I think it's something we have to be paying very close attention to, and I hear that it's going to have a really negative impact.
So the joking aside, I largely agree with a lot of what Eileen just said. I think I've been cynical about the degree to which the millionaire's tax would be pushed, in part because one is the current data that we look at now, it shows that our out-migration story is more a younger cohort, right? And so to me, I feel like if we're trying to stem the tide of out-migration, those kinds of taxes aren't the things that are the push factors, right? It's more those younger cohorts who are establishing new families. That said, in my own talk, I said if we were to effectively create enough labor for our state in order to be optimally competitive, marginal increases in labor force participation for folks with disabilities or folks with a criminal record are strategies for making sure you have enough workers. The same logic would apply if you were to say, well, wait a minute, if some percentage of millionaires were to leave because of this tax, is that a negative thing? And of course, that would be the case. So I've been skeptical about what the degree of that push factor might be. But there is that tug of war about we can't address some of the broad public policy issues in the state without revenues. And so we need strategic ways in order to have those revenues to invest in transportation, to continue to invest in the quality of our public education system, which is the best in the country. But again, there's this tipping point potentially where, oh, wait a minute, now we've pushed some people out. But from my perspective, when I look at where out-migration is now, which could not possibly include the millionaires because the data are not caught up with that yet, it seems the out-migration story is more about a different age cohort. So I think it requires careful inspection as we get more data on this, but there is a push-pull about, how do you fund the things you want and the things you need to improve. You're not going to manage your way to having a better MBTA. There's just too much back maintenance and those kind of issues, right? So.
I was trying to go like the new general manager there, the MBTA, so I'm trying to keep him out of it.
Yeah.
Seems like he's making some incremental improvements, but let's go back local. You mentioned population. We know the big population growth, at least going forward in 25 to 34. South Shore, many in this room have been entrepreneurs, startup businesses. Obviously, I want to go back to Karina on this one around retail. Could we see, we know GAP is going to have to do it differently, but is there opportunity for kind of startup and other businesses that would both attract business tax base and hopefully with affordable housing and good transportation, younger workforce to the South Shore?
Yeah, I definitely think that there's still a crave for entrepreneurship. I mean, I see it every day in the work that I do, but I think entrepreneurs have to be equipped to understand that they might have a great idea, but how does that translate that into physical space? And before, I think a lot of people were taking a gamble on, I have an idea, let me implement this, and it was going online. And we saw that during COVID, no business can just be successful digitally for the most part. And so many of them now have taken them physical. So we are seeing a huge increase on DTC brands specifically in our markets, and they're doing phenomenal. Because a lot of brands use them as marketing vehicles. So if an entrepreneur is thinking about, I want to open up a store, okay, so what does that store look like? And it now needs to become more of a marketing play rather than more so than maybe even revenue. So I would say that, yes, I think entrepreneurs have to be a lot smarter about how they're converting customers within the store and the experience that they want to have. But we're all talking about a lot of the same thing, which is how do you attract talent? And the talent has to help, whether it's healthcare. I was thinking when you said everything you said, my mother called me yesterday and she goes, I can't get my MRI because they're short-staffed. I didn't even think that was possible.
I can help her.
And so, what's interesting is about retail and healthcare and everything that we're talking about here is that it is coming with the challenge of everyone was home for so long, and there is a big effect that COVID has had on this younger generation that they feel entitled, that they don't have to work. That's perception. But a lot of them are working, they're just working so differently. They're actually working online. They are a lot of our young entrepreneurs that are starting things that but they're not going to work at our restaurants, and they're not necessarily going to work at our hospitals, and they're not necessarily working at the Gaps or the young entrepreneurs that are opening up the retail. So the talent, to attract talent now, as I mentioned before, it's coming with such different benefits. It's not so much about how much healthcare am I going to get, what's my PTO, what's my day, what are my days off, but it's now, what do you believe in? What are you about? Because this generation so strongly needs to be connected to something. And it's putting a lot of pressure on hospitals, on retailers to think differently about now how benefits need to work. And now more than ever, we're challenged with work-life balance. Retailers, all of our properties, we used to be open until 10 o'clock at night. When COVID happened, we had to have tough conversations with all of our tenant mix to say, because they did not have the talent to work, I cannot leave my door open. So as landlords, what are we going to do? We're not going to have you go anywhere, So we have to now help attract that talent, and we have to work with our retailers to figure out, how do you keep them? What are you going to be doing? And a lot of it is payroll shifts. A lot of stores don't need 4,000 square feet like they did before. They're going smaller. So it's the talent part of all of this. It has a domino effect on so much more than just creating talent. It's keeping them, it's developing them, and it's making them, again, I keep saying this, but like feel a part of something so much bigger. And that, without question, is how I'm keeping my talent, because, you know, a year ago I thought I was going to lose all of them. You know, on why it's different to work for me, for WS, and it's something that is continuously on my mind, because I'm, as a manager, it's demanded of me to think about their professional development.
That's great. That's great. We can probably learn a few things.
I was going to say.
But let's go back to Renee. Entrepreneurship. There was a question here about how to be proactive about healthcare disparities, but I want to blend that in with workforce. If you were putting on Mark's slide in 10 years, we need to move the dial in healthcare and disparities and stronger workforce, and you had two waves of your wand, what would you do to improve the workforce, improve health disparities here in the South Shore?
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, I think one thing that came to mind too when we were talking about disparity is our aging population. The elderly are living longer, and they're running out of money. So something that we see in terms of disparity is, how are they going to afford where they live? How are they going to stay in their home with care? Where are we going to find the care, right? How do we attract the caregivers? But, you know, assisted living is not affordable for everybody, right? So memory care is not affordable for everybody. So when we talk about housing, to your point, that is affordable, what about that population of people, and where are they going to live, and how are they or their families going to be able to support them? Because we see many people in the workforce now that have part-time jobs because they're caring for their elder parents. So they're working part-time, they have less income coming in, their parents are running out of money. We counsel these families all the time with, where are the resources? How am I going to make this work? I can't afford $11,000 a month for an assisted memory unit. So what am I going to do with my loved one who's unsafe at home alone? And then, where do I find somebody that's going to care for them? And how do I attract that workforce? But I do think we have to think innovatively and creative about tapping into what you're talking about, which is that population of people. How do we entice them, educate them, offer them the support they need, make them feel part of something bigger, which we certainly in healthcare should be able to make people think that they're part of something bigger, to be able to retain them. But then you go back to the housing and transportation is a big issue for us in recruitment, in particular for that lower medium salary positions. So transportation is a big issue. Housing that is affordable is a big issue.
Great, let's stay on this. So we're going to go rapid fire. We have like 3 to 5 minutes left. So 1 minute responses or less. And let's tap that one. The migrant or migration, in-migration of migrants. How can we put that to work? What are opportunities? How to harness that?
The federal government has an important role here in helping remove some of the barriers in getting refugees and migrants work authorization faster. Some of that ties to arcane policy. Jake wants to admit it. There's some arcane policy that limits refugees from being able to work with, removing those barriers. The other part too is challenges with licensure, where people will have a degree from somewhere else, and we hear these narratives a bunch where it's like, hey, my cab driver was a doctor and agent, right? So how do we create those opportunities? And there are models around that do this. We just don't do it yet in Massachusetts.
Great. Right. This might be the Melnik show right here, because most of these are around. Maybe you could just include that you can address it briefly. Maybe I don't know if you have a slide when we update it, but it says, how do you look at, and I think you touched on this, how do you look at unemployment percentage versus the below poverty rate? Kind of the trade-off. We have reasonable employment rates, right? But our poverty rates, again, relative to the state, but haven't really moved a little bit.
Well, I mean, the poverty rate's low and the unemployment rate is low, right? So I just don't The thing I find most problematic about the poverty rate is it doesn't adequately capture the basket of goods for somebody in Massachusetts. So the thing to me, it's like tacking back to the housing burden, right? So we see higher housing burden. There's actually a supplemental poverty rate for Massachusetts that combines a few different things in it. But yeah, I think, you know, for us, I think that's one of those interesting dynamics where, hey, we have really high per capita income, we have low poverty, but we all know something's going on with some populations here that make it challenging.
The next two are kind of the same. Oh, you want to take that one, Taylor?
Can I just, yeah, add to that. So I think the 800-pound gorilla in the room is the cost in Massachusetts. And I think a lot of us assume, oh, well, Massachusetts has always been a high-cost state, but that isn't the case. Up until the 1980s, we were right in the middle of the pack. And I think a lot of what we're talking about is, it is about reducing the cost structure. And we've added cost. It's a mixed metaphor, but it's been like death by 1,000 cuts on the cost front. And I do think it's time for us to, as a state, to just re-examine some of that. So Mark's slides, highest, daycare, highest unemployment, among the highest healthcare cost. What leads to that? It's no one thing, it's a series of decisions, and I think we have to start dismantling some of what is often called the Massachusetts-only cost. We don't have to be always the most generous or always the most expensive, because I think now it's to our detriment, particularly as the competition for talent and workforce is fierce. It's not just Massachusetts that's trying to find people. Our nation is aging as a whole. Now we're up against much more competition, and we have to figure out ways to reduce the cost structure, and it's no magic bullet. It's looking at every major cost component of living and doing business and seeing where we can reduce the cost.
Yeah, and I think one thing just to add to that real fast is we've been pounding on the housing issue here, but I think the other one is the home energy costs. The utility costs, residential in particular, and I think it impacts businesses as well, is extraordinarily high in Massachusetts. And I think it was really bad with inflation. There was a point where utilities year over year at the peak of inflation were up 36% in the state. And I remember having a family meeting at my house, calling the kids, they'd be like, yo, you really have to turn that off. But yeah, and so separate from housing, but it's like all those death by 1,000 cuts kind of thing.
All right, who likes to project? There's two questions here about finishing money supply and when's the next nationwide recession or economic downturn? Are we in it? Are we dipping our toes?
So on recession, I think that people keep trying to project this thing, and obviously we spent most of the last 2 years waiting for the recession to happen. It never happened. I think if we anticipate any kind of downturn, I would expect something that was slower in happening in the early to middle part of 2024, and I think a lot of it driven by demographic factors, where we just, there just isn't enough labor available. But that's my weak answer to that.
Adam, I knew I could get up to project to tell us when it was happening, the crystal ball. So, okay, thank you to all our panelists.
Thanks, Rich, Mark, Renee, Karina, Eileen. Thank you very much. Forums and discussions around these are really important to the Chamber's work on doing reality checks of where we are with our economic agenda and how we're shaping this. All of you can be part of that in some way as we continually look at some of the new initiatives we'll undertake. I think we got housing right 5 years ago, focusing on that.
Yeah.
But we got to keep moving, and we have a few others. So thank you all very much for this. Thank all of you for your support of the Chamber and being engaged business leaders on the Sloan Shore. Representative Joe Mosquito, I see stuck into my table. I didn't see that. I represent it. If you are interested in housing, the Lieutenant Governor and Secretary of Housing are going to be at a forum. It's when is it? November 17th, 2 to 4 on a Friday. We are trying to limit it so it can be a discussion with local officials about housing to about 100, 125 people. But if you are in the housing industry, interested in housing, and would like to be part of that, send us an email. We will be sending you a survey. People are waving to me in the back. What did you want? Just shout out what you're trying to get me to say.
QR codes on the sheet on their tables.
Okay, on the sheets there are QR codes for the survey. We would like to get feedback, since part of the post-COVID stuff is we have to rethink the types of programs, when, how, where. So we have a QR code. Please check that. Check your inboxes for the slide deck. And thank you all. There is no more traffic outside.